Mockery had a price in Russell Roberts's world, and he paid it without blinking. So when he told his secretary to clear her calendar for the syndicate's most exclusive dinner of the year, it wasn't a kindness, it was a setup, a bet, a chance to watch the quiet girl fold under the weight of a room built to eat people alive. He pictured a wrinkled blouse and a stammered excuse. What he got instead was a woman who walked through the restaurant doors like she'd already won an argument he hadn't started yet, and every word he'd rehearsed evaporated on his tongue. The Vanguard Syndicate didn't hide in back alleys. It sat on the 38th floor of a black glass tower downtown, all marble and imported espresso, its violence filed neatly under operating expenses. Julie Collier had spent 2 years running that machine from a desk no one bothered to look twice at, quiet, forgettable, and armed with every number that ever passed through the building. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. Russell Roberts didn't do favors. Everyone on the 38th floor knew that much, which was exactly why the request landed like a joke before he'd finished saying it. She irons her own lunch bag, Russ. I'd bet my cut on it. Damon Reyes lounged against the edge of Russell's desk, tie loosened, a tumbler of something dark catching the light. He was the syndicate's second and Russell's cousin, and he wore malice the way other men wore cologne, liberally, and without apology. Bring her to the dinner Friday. Tell her it's mandatory. Watch her show up in something from the clearance rack while half the East Coast's worth of trouble sits at that table. Russell didn't look up from the ledger on his screen. She's efficient. She's wallpaper, Damon corrected, glancing through the glass toward the desk where Julie sat, hunched over a spreadsheet, a pencil tucked behind her ear. I don't think I've ever seen the woman blink out of turn. Somebody dropped a filing cabinet on Denny's foot last month, and she just asked him to move his chair, so she could get to the printer. She had a deadline. She always has a deadline. Damon grinned, the kind of grin that had gotten men killed for less. Come on. It's one dinner. She'll spend the whole night hiding behind a bread basket, and it'll be the funniest thing that's happened in this building all year. Russell finally looked up. Through the glass, Julie was exactly where she always was, head down, unremarkable, entirely beneath the notice of the men who ran their empire 2 floors above her filing cabinets. It was a bad idea. It was petty and beneath him, and he knew it. If she cries, Russell said, you're the one apologizing to HR. Deal. 10 minutes later, Russell crossed the floor himself. The room quieted the way it always did when he moved through it. Julie didn't look up until his knuckles rapped once against her desk. Mr. Roberts. Her voice was even, unbothered. The Denholm accounts reconciled. The variance was a transposed digit, nothing else. Good. He studied her for a moment. No makeup, a smudge of highlighter on her wrist, eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder. Clear your evening Friday. She reached for her planner, without hesitation. Is there a filing deadline I'm not aware of? It's a dinner. The Ashcroft account holders, upper management only. A lie, and they both knew her title didn't belong anywhere near that sentence. Formal. For half a second, something moved behind her eyes. Quick, sharp. Gone before he could name it. Then it smoothed back into the same practiced calm she wore like a uniform. Understood, she said. Should I prepare the quarterly summaries, or is this purely a courtesy appearance? Just be there. He turned before she could answer, an unfamiliar weight settling somewhere under his ribs. It was one dinner, a small, harmless bit of theater. He told himself that all the way back to his office, and didn't quite believe it. Julie Collier had learned over 2 years at the Vanguard Syndicate that survival wasn't about being good at your job. It was about being furniture. You didn't get noticed by men like Russell Roberts by excelling. You got noticed by making a mistake, and mistakes in this building tended to end careers in ways that had nothing to do with severance packages. So Julie had perfected the art of disappearing in plain sight. She wore blouses buttoned to the throat and slacks in shades that didn't have names, just descriptions: oatmeal, putty, the color of a Tuesday. Her hair stayed scraped back in a clip that gave her a dull ache behind her left ear by 3 p.m. most days, an ache she'd stopped noticing months ago. She arrived at 7:45, had Russell's coffee, black, no sugar, cup turned handle right, on his desk by 8 o'clock, and spent the rest of her day buried in numbers that most people in the building pretended didn't exist. She knew what the syndicate was. You didn't process wire transfers routed through 4 shell companies in 3 countries and stay naive about it for long. But the dental was excellent. The 401k match was generous, and nobody had ever once questioned why a 26-year-old with a finance degree and $90,000 in student debt might choose steady, well-compensated silence over principle. The syndicate, for all its faults, was scrupulous about 2 things: its books and its employees' safety. A man had made a comment about her legs in the break room during her 2nd month. He'd been reassigned to the Newark distribution center and never mentioned again. Julie had learned not to ask questions she didn't want answered. She liked the numbers. They didn't lie, didn't posture, didn't require her to smile at things that weren't funny. She could lose herself in a spreadsheet for 6 hours and forget, briefly, that the sums she was balancing represented things she'd rather not name. It was a good trade, she told herself. Invisibility for safety. Silence for a paycheck that let her mother stay in the good facility, the one with actual nurses instead of aides who forgot to turn her on schedule. The 38th floor didn't look like anyone's idea of a criminal enterprise. It looked like money, clean lines, cold marble, glass offices that let Russell watch his floor the way a hawk watches a field. The coffee machine cost more than Julie's car. The art on the walls was real and insured, and occasionally rotated by a consultant who charged more per hour than Julie made in a week. Violence, when it happened elsewhere, in rooms Julie never saw and files she was occasionally asked to make disappear. Up here, everything was spreadsheets and quarterly targets and men in $6,000 suits pretending they ran an ordinary business. Damon Reyes did not pretend particularly well. He liked people to know exactly what he was, which was, in Julie's professional opinion, a lieutenant with more charisma than sense and a taste for cruelty he mistook for wit. He came through the office most afternoons trailing cologne and menace in equal measure, and today he'd planted himself against the frame of Russell's office door like he owned the building, which, Julie supposed, glancing up briefly before returning to her screen, in some percentage sense he did. She couldn't hear what they were saying through the glass, not exactly, but she'd gotten good at reading the shape of conversations from a distance. Damon was performing something, a hand thrown out, a grin too wide for whatever he was describing. Russell had that particular stillness he got when he was unimpressed but hadn't decided yet whether to be annoyed about it. Julie had catalogued that stillness the way she catalogued everything, filed, cross-referenced, unremarked upon. She didn't know, and wouldn't have guessed, that she was the subject. "She's a spreadsheet with a pulse," Damon was saying, swirling his drink, eyes flicking through the glass toward her desk. "I'm telling you, Russ. Cut her open. I bet you find a calculator instead of a heart." "She's competent," Russell said, not looking up from his tablet. "She's a ghost in orthopedic flats." Damon pushed off the doorframe, warming to the idea now, the way he warmed to most ideas that involved someone else's discomfort. The dinner Friday. The Ashcroft people, the whole East Coast circuit, half of them still convinced were barely legitimate. "Bring her." Russell's eyes came up slowly. "Bring my secretary to a dinner with the Ashcrofts. Tell her it's mandatory. Tell her to dress nice." Damon grinned, and there was nothing warm in it. "Watch her walk in wearing something from a department store, while Marcus Ashcroft's wife is dripping in Cartier. It'll be the best entertainment we've had all quarter. And I'd pay real money to watch her try to make conversation with anyone at that table who isn't a ledger." Russell looked past his cousin, through the glass, to where Julie sat with a pencil behind her ear, chewing the inside of her cheek at something on her monitor. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to look like, small, careful, unthreatening. Forgettable in the specific way that made her excellent at her job and invisible everywhere else. It was a bad idea. He knew that the way he knew most bad ideas, instantly, and without much interest in stopping himself. "If she cries," Russell said, "it's your problem to clean up." Damon laughed, already reaching for his phone to spread the joke before Russell had finished agreeing to it. Julie didn't cry when she got home. She locked her door, kicked off her flats, and stood in the middle of her studio apartment for a long moment, letting the silence tell her what she already knew. She wasn't stupid. You didn't spend 2 years reconciling accounts for men who talked about logistics the way other companies talked about shipping and stay naive about how the world actually worked. She'd seen the guest list for Friday. She'd approved the catering budget herself, line by line, 6 weeks ago, back when it was just another spreadsheet and not a trap with her name on the invitation. Marcus Ashcroft would be there, and the people who orbited him, and half the men who made Russell Roberts' floor go quiet when they walked through it. She'd also seen the way Damon Reyes looked at her through the glass that afternoon. She'd been looking at a pivot table, not at him, but she'd felt it anyway, the particular weight of being someone's punchline before you'd even heard the joke. She didn't need to hear the words to know the shape of them. Bring the secretary. Watch her fold. They wanted a show. Fine. Julie had spent 2 years being underestimated by men who couldn't do long division without a calculator, and she was tired, bone tired, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, of making herself smaller so they wouldn't feel threatened by the fact that she wasn't. She walked into her bathroom and looked at herself under the flat, unflattering light. Tired eyes. A face that had learned, very deliberately, how to communicate nothing. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman drowning quietly in student debt and a mother's medical bills, doing her best not to make waves in a building full of sharks. Not this time, she said to the mirror, and her voice didn't sound like her own, flatter, harder, something with an edge she didn't recognize but didn't mind, either. She opened her laptop and pulled up her savings account. $6,200. Her emergency fund, the number she'd built slowly, dollar by dollar, in case the syndicate ever came apart at the seams or she found herself standing too close to the wrong kind of trouble. It was supposed to be untouchable. She stared at it for exactly 4 seconds before she transferred $5,000 of it into checking. If they wanted a joke, she'd give them one they wouldn't forget. The next afternoon, she took a half day, the first one she'd used in over a year, and had a car take her to a stretch of Fifth Avenue she usually only walked past on her lunch break, eyes forward, pretending she belonged somewhere in that direction. The boutique she chose had no prices in the window and a doorman who looked at her sensible shoes for a half second too long before deciding, apparently, that her money was as good as anyone's. The saleswoman inside had the kind of posture that came from decades of sizing people up before they finished a sentence. She glanced at Julie's gray slacks, her flat, unremarkable blouse, and opened her mouth, probably to redirect her towards something more affordable a few blocks over. "I need a dress," Julie said before she could. Her voice had none of its usual office softness. "Floor length. Black. I have $4,000 and it needs to look like it could end an argument." The saleswoman's expression shifted, slow and considering, into something that might have been respect. "This way." The dress they found her wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. It didn't sparkle, didn't catch light so much as swallow it. Structured black silk, backless, held together at the shoulders by 2 thin lines of gunmetal chain. The neckline was severe, almost architectural, cutting straight across her collarbones with no apology. It fit her like it had been built for her specifically, revealing a shape she'd spent a decade burying under wool and bad tailoring. She bought heels with a heel thin enough to be a weapon and a small black clutch, hard-edged and unyielding in her hand. By Friday afternoon, she was in a salon chair, watching a stranger's hands move through her hair. "What are we thinking?" the stylist asked. "Darker," Julie said. "Almost black. And cut it sharp. A bob jaw length." She watched pale strands fall away in the mirror, watched the ash-brown dullness give way to something rich and deliberate. The cut framed a jawline she hadn't seen clearly in years, sharpened her whole face into something with edges. When it came to makeup, she didn't ask for natural. She asked for a deep red lip, the color of something final, and eyes lined dark enough to look like a decision rather than an accident. She stood in front of the salon's full-length mirror afterward and didn't recognize the woman looking back. Not unkindly, just factually. This wasn't Julie the secretary, the woman who apologized when other people bumped into her. This was someone who'd stopped asking permission somewhere between the transfer of funds and the first snip of scissors. She slid into the dress that evening alone in her apartment, fastened the chains at her shoulders, stepped into the heels, and picked up the clutch. She didn't feel like she was getting ready for dinner. She felt like she was arming herself for something closer to a war. "Let's go hear the joke," she said to her empty apartment, and reached for her coat. Altano's smelled like money that had never had to introduce itself. Orchids flown in that morning, bourbon older than most of the guests, and beneath it all, the faint metallic hush of a room full of people who understood exactly how dangerous everyone else at the party was. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light over a sea of tailored black and jewelry that could have covered a mortgage. A string trio worked through something classical in the corner, valiantly ignoring the fact that a fair percentage of the men in the room had, at some point, discussed killing each other over dinner reservations far less exclusive than this one. Russell stood near the bar with a scotch he wasn't drinking, nodding at the right moments as Marcus Ashcroft's second-in-command explained, at length, a logistics problem Russell had already solved 2 weeks ago. He kept one eye on the entrance without meaning to. It was 8:12. Julie had never been late to anything in the 2 years he'd known her. She'd once emailed him a spreadsheet update at 6:47 a.m. during a blizzard that had shut down half the subway system. "She's not coming." Damon materialized at his elbow, looking entirely too pleased with himself, a fresh drink already sweating in his hand. "I give her credit for lasting this long before bailing. She probably took one look at the dress code and had a small breakdown in a Dwayne Reed." "She's not the type to bail," Russell said, and was faintly irritated at himself for the certainty in it. "She's the type to iron her own napkins at home, Russ. There's a difference between not bailing and having anything to wear, too." Damon didn't finish the sentence. Nobody near the entrance finished whatever they'd been saying either, because the room did something Russell had only seen it do twice before, once for a senator, once for a woman who'd walked in wearing a dress made entirely of what turned out to be real emeralds. The conversation didn't stop so much as it thinned, attention bending collectively toward the door like iron filings finding a magnet. Russell turned to see what had done it, and for a full 3 seconds, his brain simply refused to process the information his eyes were sending it. The woman in the doorway wore black, floor-length, backless, held together at the shoulders by chains that looked like they'd been forged rather than bought. The dress didn't catch the chandelier light so much as absorb it, which made everyone standing near her look slightly overdressed by comparison. Her hair was dark now, nearly black, cut into a sharp bob that framed a jaw Russell hadn't known she had. Her lips were the color of something final. She stood in the doorway for exactly as long as it took the room to notice her, and not a second longer, then started walking, and the heels she wore struck the marble floor with the precise, unhurried rhythm of someone who had never once in her life doubted she belonged wherever she happened to be standing. It took Russell an embarrassingly long moment to understand that he was looking at Julie Collier. Beside him, Damon had gone completely silent, his drink hanging forgotten in his hand, mouth slightly open in a way that would have been satisfying to witness under any other circumstances. Russell felt the joke he'd been half-preparing all week, something dry, something about the seating chart, an easy line to deploy the moment she arrived looking exactly as out of place as Damon had promised, simply evaporate. He had nothing. He stood there with a scotch going warm in his hand and watched his secretary cross a room full of the most dangerous people on the eastern seaboard like she'd been doing it her entire life. She didn't look around for him, didn't scan the room for a familiar face the way most people did on unfamiliar territory. She moved like she already knew exactly where everything was, which was, Russell realized with a strange lurch in his chest, probably true, she built the seating chart. She'd approved every line item on tonight's budget. She knew this room better than most of the people currently gawking at her. "Mr. Roberts." She stopped in front of him, and her voice was the same voice he heard every morning delivering coffee and reconciled ledgers, except now it landed differently, low and even, entirely unbothered by the fact that half the room was still staring. "Thank you for the invitation, Miss Collier." It came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, recalibrating something in himself that felt, uncomfortably, like ground shifting underfoot. "You look," he stopped. He was not a man who fumbled for words. He fumbled for the word. Appropriate for a formal event, she offered, a faint, almost invisible curve at the corner of her mouth, there and gone. I believe that was the assignment. Somewhere behind him, Russell heard Damon make a small, strangled sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh dying somewhere in his throat. "Damon," Julie said, turning to him with the same cool pleasantness she used for quarterly reports, "I saw the Ashcroft catering invoice came in 11% over budget. I'll have a revised breakdown on your desk Monday." Damon opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Russell looked at his cousin, then back at Julie, and felt something shift under his ribs that he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite admiration, not quite alarm. Something adjacent to both. The joke was supposed to be that she wouldn't survive this room. Instead, she was standing in the middle of it, entirely unbothered, while the room rearranged itself quietly around her, the way rooms did around people who were dangerous and simply hadn't announced it yet. "Drink?" Russell asked, because it was the only thing he could think to say, and because some part of him, professional and detached only moments ago, very much wanted to know what she'd say next. "Please," Julie said. "Something dark." Dinner was seated at a long table near the center of the ballroom, close enough to the string quartet that conversation required a certain amount of leaning in, which suited a room full of people who preferred not to be overheard. Julie found herself between Russell and a woman named Elena Ashcroft, who wore diamonds like punctuation and asked exactly 2 polite questions before losing interest and turning to the man on her other side. Julie didn't mind. She'd spent 2 years being the person nobody bothered to make conversation with. It gave her time to watch the table instead of perform for it. Marcus Ashcroft sat across from Russell, flanked by his lawyer and a man Julie recognized from the guest list only as financial advisor, a title that in this room meant something closer to accountant with a gun permit. Ashcroft was in his 50s, silver at the temples, with a particular smoothness of a man who'd never once in his adult life had to raise his voice to be obeyed. He'd been pleasant through the appetizer and the first course, complimenting the wine, asking Russell about a shipment out of the port that Julie happened to know was running 2 days behind schedule due to a customs inspection nobody had bothered to flag to him yet. It was somewhere around the second course that Ashcroft set down his fork with a precision that suggested the gesture had been planned several courses earlier. "Russell." His voice carried just enough to draw the attention of the 6 or 7 people closest to them, which Julie suspected was the point. "I want to raise something." "Delicately, of course, given the setting." "Delicately," Russell repeated, without warmth. "The Cayman reconciliation." Q2. Ashcroft folded his hands. "My people flagged a variance. 240,000, give or take. That doesn't trace cleanly to the numbers your office sent over in March. I'm sure it's nothing. Rounding, administrative noise. But it's the kind of nothing that makes a man's advisors nervous, and nervous advisors make for long, tedious phone calls that neither of us has time for." Julie watched Russell's jaw tighten fractionally, the same stillness she'd cataloged through the glass wall of his office 100 times before, except now it was aimed at a man with enough weight behind him to make an accusation like this land as something closer to a threat than a question. Beside Ashcroft, his financial advisor produced a folder with the practiced ease of a man who'd been waiting all evening for this exact cue, and slid a printed page toward the center of the table. $241,612 to be precise, the advisor said, tapping the page. "Unaccounted for between the March filing and the April reconciliation." Russell hadn't touched the page. His eyes had gone to Julie instead, a question in them she understood immediately. Not because she'd expected to be tested tonight, but because she'd built every number on that page herself, months ago, in a cubicle nobody remembered to look into. "May I?" Julie said, and it wasn't really a question. She reached across and turned the paper toward herself without waiting for permission, scanned it for perhaps 4 seconds, and set it back down. "The variance isn't in the March filing," she said. Her voice was the same even, unhurried register she used for status updates, except now every person within earshot had gone quiet to hear it. "It's in how your office is reading the March filing. You're comparing gross figures against our net reconciliation, which already accounts for the Belize transfer fees and the currency conversion on the euro-denominated portion of that shipment. If you back those out, which, respectfully, Your advisor should have done before printing this. The actual variance is $11,400, and it's sitting in an escrow account pending the Port Authority's release on the delayed shipment. I assume nobody's mentioned to you yet." The table had gone very still. Ashcroft's advisor opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened the folder again, as though the numbers might have rearranged themselves in his favor while he wasn't looking. "The shipment's delayed," Julie continued, before he could recover, "because customs flagged 3 containers for inspection out of Miami on the 14th. It'll clear by Tuesday. The escrow releases automatically 48 hours after customs sign-off, which will bring your Cayman numbers back in line without anyone needing to make a phone call at all." She paused, and there was something almost gentle in the way she added, "I'd be happy to send the documentation over Monday morning, Mr. Ashcroft, if it would put your advisors at ease." For a moment nobody at the table said anything. Somewhere behind Julie, the quartet finished a movement and started another, oblivious. Ashcroft looked at Julie for a long beat, something recalculating behind his eyes, the same recalibration Julie had watched ripple through the entrance hall an hour earlier, except now it was aimed directly at her. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone had lost its edge entirely. "Julie Collier. I handle financial operations for Mr. Roberts' office." "Handle," Ashcroft repeated, glancing at his advisor, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. "I see." Russell hadn't said a word through any of it. He was watching Julie with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise, exactly, though there was some of that in it, but underneath it something sharper, more attentive, like a man recalculating the value of an asset he'd badly undercounted. Across the table, Damon had stopped eating entirely, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, watching the woman he'd bet against an hour earlier dismantle a 5-family patriarch's accusation with the casual precision of someone correcting a typo. "Well." Ashcroft picked his fork back up, and something in his posture had shifted, recalibrated toward respect he hadn't been offering 10 minutes earlier. "I appreciate the clarity, Miss Collier. It's rare to get a straight answer at this table." "I find straight answers save everyone time," Julie said, and reached for her wine, entirely unbothered, while beside her Russell sat back in his chair and looked at his secretary like he was seeing her, properly, for the very first time that night, or perhaps for the first time in 2 years. Dinner wound down the way these things always did, in a slow drift of cigars and quiet business conversations conducted in the language of golf handicaps and children's private schools, everyone pretending for one evening that they ran ordinary companies. Julie excused herself from a conversation with Ashcroft's wife about a charity gala neither of them cared about and found the terrace, where the noise of the ballroom thinned into something almost bearable. The air outside was cold enough to raise goose flesh along her bare shoulders, and she was grateful for it. Her feet ached in the steel-tipped heels, a dull throb she'd been ignoring for the better part of 2 hours, and there was a strange, hollowed-out feeling settling into her now that the performance had ended. Not regret, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the come-down after holding a note too long. She heard the terrace door open behind her and didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "You disappeared," Russell said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could smell the scotch on him, faint and expensive. "I needed air. Your industry runs warm." That earned something close to a smile, there and gone in the dark. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city instead of at her, which she appreciated. It was easier to talk to the skyline than to him directly. $11,400, he said eventually. "Off the top of your head." "It's not difficult math." "It's not the math I'm asking about." He turned then, and the streetlight caught the sharp planes of his face, the particular stillness he wore when he was actually paying attention to something instead of merely tolerating it.
2 years, Julie.
2 years you've sat 40 feet from my office, and I don't think I've heard you string together more than a status update. Tonight you took apart Marcus Ashcroft's entire accusation in under a minute, in front of half the East Coast, without so much as raising your voice. You didn't ask. That's not an answer. Julie looked back out at the skyline, at the small distant lights of a city that had never once noticed her either, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she wanted to give him the real one. "Nobody asks the furniture what it thinks, Mr. Roberts." You learn that fast in a place like this. The men who get noticed for being smart also get noticed, period. And getting noticed in your world has a way of becoming a liability. She glanced at him. I watched a man get transferred to Newark for whistling at me in a break room. I've also watched what happens to people who make themselves useful enough to be dangerous and not useful enough to be protected. I decided a long time ago which one I'd rather be. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite guilt, but close enough to its neighborhood. You thought I'd see you as a threat. I thought you'd see me as replaceable the moment I stopped being convenient. She said it evenly, without accusation, the way she might have delivered a line item. It's not personal, Russell. It's just how this building works. I've spent 2 years being exactly useful enough to keep my job and exactly invisible enough to keep my head down. It's a survivable equation. And tonight I got tired of solving for the same variable. She turned to face him fully now, chin level. None of the careful smallness she wore into that building every morning. Your cousin invited me here to be a joke, Mr. Roberts. I decided I'd rather be the punchline that hits back. Russell studied her for a long moment, and Julie let him, feeling none of the instinct to look away that used to live in her whenever he glanced in her direction. Something had rearranged itself between them somewhere over the second course, and neither of them seemed inclined to pretend otherwise now. Damon's going to be insufferable for a week, he said finally. He's never going to admit he was wrong. I don't need him to admit it. I need him to stop underestimating the woman who does his expense reports. A faint, dry edge crept into her voice. Though, I imagine that particular lesson is going to take longer than a week. Russell laughed, a real laugh, short and startled out of him, the kind Julie suspected he didn't let many people hear. It changed his whole face, softened the sharp architecture of it into something almost human. You've been sitting on this the entire time. 2 years of quarterly filings and dry commentary, and this is who's been underneath it. This is who's always been underneath it, Julie corrected. You just never ask. He held her gaze a beat longer than the conversation strictly required, something calculating and curious moving behind his eyes, the look of a man reassessing an asset he'd badly undervalued. I'm asking now. Then I'd start by not wasting me on reconciliations, Julie said. You have people for that. I'm better used somewhere that actually requires thinking. For a moment neither of them said anything, the city humming quietly below them, the ballroom noise a distant, muffled thing behind the terrace doors. Then Russell nodded, slow and deliberate, the way he nodded when a decision had actually been made rather than merely considered. Monday, he said. My office. We'll talk about what that looks like. I'll bring the Cayman documentation, Julie said, and this time, when she almost smiled, she let him see it. Julie arrived at the office Monday morning the way she always did, 7:45, coffee already in hand, though this time it was her own, not Russell's, and she found herself oddly uncertain what to do with the extra 10 minutes that used to belong to his cup. She'd worn the gray slacks again, the ones the color of nothing in particular, and had almost reached for the severe clip before catching herself in the mirror and leaving her hair loose instead, still cropped short from Friday, still darker than it had been a week ago. It felt like a compromise. She wasn't the woman in the black dress every day of her life. But she wasn't entirely the woman in the oatmeal blouse anymore either. Russell's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, who'd clearly heard some version of Friday night by now, judging by the way he kept glancing at Julie like she might combust, buzzed her straight through at 9 o'clock without making her wait, which had never happened in 2 years of appointments. Russell was behind his desk, tablet forgotten, an actual folder open in front of him instead. He looked up when she came in and did not, she noticed, look surprised to see her in the same slacks as always. Sit, he said, and then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, please. Julie sat. She set the Cayman documentation on his desk without being asked, and he glanced at it, then set it aside without opening it, which told her more than any speech would have. I've been thinking about Friday, he said. I assumed. I want you handling financial operations, not reconciliations, not filing. The actual architecture, Cayman, Belize, the shell structure, the parts of this business that currently live in about 6 different people's heads and none of them talk to each other. He said it flatly, the way he said everything, but there was something underneath it Julie hadn't heard from him before. Not quite hesitation, but a kind of deliberate weight, like a man aware he was placing something valuable into hands he'd only just started to trust. Director of Financial Operations. You'd report directly to me. You'd have authority over every account this organization touches. Julie kept her face perfectly still, a skill she'd spent 2 years perfecting for exactly the wrong reasons, and was now grateful to still have. That's Damon's territory. Nominally. Damon doesn't know what a P&L statement is, Russell said, without heat, simply stating a fact. He runs muscle and relationships. He's good at both. He is not good at the thing you did to Marcus Ashcroft on Friday, and we both know it. He's not going to like this. No, Russell agreed. He isn't. Julie considered it. Not the offer itself, which she'd already decided to accept somewhere on the terrace 2 nights ago, but the shape of what came after. Titles in this building came with targets attached. She'd spent 2 years surviving by being beneath anyone's notice. This was the opposite of that, deliberately, permanently. I'll want authority to actually restructure things, she said. Not just audit them. If I find problems, I need the power to fix them without asking permission every time. Something flickered across Russell's face that might have been approval. Done. And I'll want it in writing. Not because I don't trust you, she added before he could take offense, but because everyone else in this building is going to need to see it in writing before they believe it. Russell almost smiled at that. Fair. The paperwork took Peter most of the afternoon, and by the time Julie's new title was circulated through the executive floor, the temperature of every conversation she had shifted noticeably. People who'd never made eye contact with her held doors now. Someone from legal actually apologized for a minor delay on a document instead of simply not responding to her emails for 4 days, which had been the previous standard. Damon found her in her new office, larger, closer to Russell's, with an actual window instead of the cubicle wall she'd spent 2 years memorizing. Late in the afternoon, leaning in the doorway with the particular loose posture of a man trying very hard to look unbothered. Director, he said, testing the word like it tasted bad. Damon. Cute trick Friday. He wandered in without being invited, picked up a stapler off her desk, turned it over in his hands like it might explain something to him. Didn't realize the secretary had claws. I've always had claws. You just never gave me a reason to use them. Julie didn't look up from the file in front of her, which she suspected annoyed him more than any retort could have. Was there something you needed, or did you come to admire the office? I came to say I'll be reviewing every number you put in front of Russell from now on. He set the stapler down harder than necessary. Just so we're clear on how this works. You're welcome to review anything you'd like. Julie finally looked up at him, and there was nothing soft in it now, nothing that apologized for taking up space. I'd start with the Belize account, actually. There's a discrepancy in the shipping manifests I've been meaning to raise with someone. I think you'll find it very educational. Something in Damon's face shifted. The first flicker of genuine uncertainty Julie had seen from him, a man recalculating an equation he'd been confident about for years. He didn't have a response ready, which was, Julie thought, probably the first time that had happened to him in this building. We'll talk, he said finally, which wasn't an answer at all, and left without picking the stapler back up. Julie watched him go, then returned to the file in front of her. Real numbers now, real authority, the kind of power she'd spent 2 years pretending she didn't want. She thought of the woman in the black dress, the one who'd walked through Altano's like she owned it and understood, for the first time, that she hadn't left that woman behind on Friday night. She'd just started wearing her, permanently, underneath the gray slacks. The Belize account took Julie 3 weeks to properly understand, which was either a testament to how badly it had been hidden or how little anyone before her had bothered to look. She'd mentioned it to Damon as a bluff, mostly, a line thrown out to unsettle him, but the deeper she got into the shipping manifests, the less it felt like a bluff and the more it felt like she'd accidentally put her hand on something that had been waiting patiently to be found. The discrepancy was small at first glance, which was, Julie had learned, exactly how the real problems always presented themselves. A logistics fee here, a customs surcharge there, numbers that individually looked like the ordinary friction of moving product through 3 jurisdictions with varying degrees of legality. But Julie didn't look at numbers individually. She looked at patterns, and the pattern in the Blissie account had a rhythm to it. Small, regular schemes, always under the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit, always timed to land during quarters when the reconciliation team was stretched thin with year-end filings. Someone had built this carefully. Someone who understood exactly where the syndicate's financial blind spots lived, because they'd helped design the systems that created them in the first place. She brought it to Russell on a Thursday evening, after Peter had gone home and the executive floor had gone quiet enough that their voices carried in a way they wouldn't have during the day. She spread 3 months of manifests across his desk, color-coded in a system only she fully understood, and walked him through it the way she'd walk anyone through a problem, patiently, without drama, letting the numbers do the persuading. $412,000 over 18 months, she said. Structured specifically to stay under audit flags. Whoever's doing this knows our internal review schedule. They know when the quarterly checks happen and when they don't. This isn't opportunistic. This is someone with access to the compliance calendar. Russell studied the pages in silence for a long moment, his jaw doing the thing it did when he was calculating something he didn't like the shape of. How many people have access to that calendar? Compliance, obviously.
My office, now.
Legal, for scheduling purposes. Julie hesitated, and it was the hesitation, more than anything, that made Russell look up sharply. Say it. Damon's office has visibility into it too. Not direct access to modify it, but he receives the quarterly compliance briefing same as you do. Anyone on his staff could have the dates. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Julie could hear the building's ventilation systems cycling somewhere above them. Russell's expression hadn't changed exactly, but something behind it had gone very still. The particular stillness she'd learned, over 2 years, meant he was somewhere past anger and into something colder. You're not accusing him. I'm not accusing anyone yet. I'm telling you who had the information required to build this, and there's a short list. Julie kept her voice level, deliberately so. She understood, better than most people in this building probably did, exactly how dangerous an accusation like this could be if it was wrong, and exactly how much more dangerous it would be if it was right, and nobody said anything. I want 3 more weeks. I want to trace the actual withdrawal accounts, not just the manifests. If I can put a name on the receiving end of this money, we're not guessing anymore. Russell nodded slowly, though Julie could see the effort it took him to sit with the ambiguity instead of moving immediately toward whatever his instincts wanted to do about family who might be stealing from him. 3 weeks. Quietly. I don't want Damon knowing you're looking at this specifically. I already told him I found a discrepancy in the Blissie account. That was 3 weeks ago. Then he already knows you're looking, Russell said, something grim settling into his voice. Which means whoever's behind this knows too. Julie hadn't considered that angle fully until he said it out loud, and she felt the small, cold drop of understanding that came with realizing she might have moved a piece on the board before fully mapping what was behind it. She'd meant the comment to Damon as a warning shot, a way of establishing that she wasn't someone to be dismissed. She hadn't considered that it might also be a warning to whoever was actually guilty, giving them 3 weeks' notice to cover their tracks, or worse, to decide that Julie Collier, freshly promoted and inconveniently thorough, had become a problem that needed handling. I'll be careful, she said, though even as she said it, she understood it wasn't entirely in her control anymore. Russell was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last 30 seconds from strategic concern into something more personal, something Julie hadn't seen directed at her before and wasn't entirely sure how to categorize. You'll be careful, he repeated, and you'll tell me the moment anything feels wrong. Not after. The moment. That's not really how I operate. I like to have the full picture before I... Julie. His voice had an edge to it now, quiet but absolute. I've buried people who thought they had time to build the full picture. You come to me the second something feels off. That's not a request. She met his eyes and found, underneath the authority in his voice, something that looked uncomfortably close to worry, Not the detached concern of a man protecting an asset, but something warmer and more complicated that neither of them seemed inclined to name yet. "Understood," she said, and meant it. She gathered the manifests back into their folder, aware of him watching her the entire time, and understood. With the same clear-eyed precision she brought to every column of numbers she'd ever balanced, that the trail she was following didn't just lead toward a thief. It led directly into the one part of Russell's world he'd never expected to have to audit, his own family. The name, when it finally surfaced, wasn't Damon's. Julie found it on a Tuesday night, alone in her office with the lights low and 3 monitors full of wire transfer records that had taken her the better part of 2 weeks to untangle. The receiving accounts routed through Belize, then Panama, then a personal holding company registered to a name she recognized instantly because she'd typed it 100 times over 2 years, always in the context of expense reports and travel reimbursements that had never once raised a flag.
Peter.
Russell's assistant. The nervous young man who buzzed people through, who fetched coffee, who had access to every calendar, every compliance schedule, every quiet gap in the review process because he was the one who scheduled the reviews in the first place. Julie sat very still for a long moment, staring at the screen, running the numbers back through her head twice to make sure she hadn't made an error born of exhaustion. She hadn't. $412,000, siphoned in careful increments by a 24-year-old with unrestricted calendar access and, apparently, a gambling problem that a quick, quiet search of public records made unpleasantly easy to confirm. She should have called Russell immediately. She knew that, even as she reached instead for her phone to pull the last piece of documentation together first, the final wire, the one that would make the case airtight instead of merely compelling. It was the same instinct that had always served her well with numbers. Don't bring someone a half-finished picture. Bring them the whole thing. It was the wrong instinct tonight, and she understood that the moment her office door opened without a knock. Peter stood in the doorway, and he didn't look nervous anymore. That was the detail Julie's mind fixed on first, oddly. 2 years of watching him fumble coffee orders and apologize for hallway delays, and now he stood there with a stillness that reminded her uncomfortably of Russell, except hollowed out, wrong, missing whatever quality made Russell's stillness feel controlled instead of simply empty. "You should have stopped 3 weeks ago," Peter said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, which made it worse. "When you told Damon about the discrepancy, that was your exit ramp. You didn't take it." Julie's hand moved slowly toward the phone on her desk, and Peter crossed the room fast enough to close his hand over hers before she reached it, his grip harder than his slight frame suggested it should be. "Don't," he said. "Please. I don't want this to be complicated." "It's already complicated, Peter." Julie kept her voice level, drawing on the same flat, unhurried register she'd used on Marcus Ashcroft, though her heart was hammering hard enough now that she could feel it in her throat. $400,000 doesn't disappear quietly. You know that better than anyone. Whatever you're planning right now makes it worse, not better. "I have a boat reservation for Thursday. A new name. I just needed a few more days before anyone noticed." His eyes moved to her screen, to the wire transfer record still open, and something desperate flickered across his face. "You weren't supposed to find it this fast. I found it because you weren't as careful as you thought." Julie forced herself to keep talking, to keep her voice steady, buying seconds she wasn't sure would matter. "Russell knows I've been tracing this. If I don't check in by 9, he's going to come looking." It was, technically, a lie. She'd told Russell 3 weeks, not tonight specifically, but it was the kind of lie built on a plausible enough truth that she watched it land, watched Peter's grip on her hand falter slightly as he recalculated. "You don't understand what happens to me if he finds out," Peter said, and there was real fear in it now, raw and young. "You don't understand what he does to people who steal from him." "I do understand," Julie said, quieter now, deliberately softening. "I've watched what happens to people in this building for 2 years, Peter. I know exactly what you're afraid of, but hurting me doesn't fix any of it. It just adds a second crime to a first one that might still be survivable." For a moment she thought it might actually work. She watched something in his face waver, the desperate arithmetic of a scared young man trying to find an exit that didn't end in violence. And then the office door opened again, and Russell was there, and whatever calculation Peter had been running collapsed entirely into panic. He shoved Julie back hard enough that she caught herself against the desk, monitors rattling, and bolted for the door Russell was blocking. What happened next took less than 10 seconds, Russell moving with an efficient, economical violence that Julie had never seen from him and understood. Watching it was probably the truest version of the man she'd been working for, and then Peter was on the floor, and it was over, and Julie was standing with her back against her desk, breathing hard, unhurt but shaking in a way she hadn't expected of herself. Russell crossed the room to her immediately, hands finding her shoulders, checking her over with an urgency that had nothing calculated in it at all. "I'm fine," Julie said, though her voice wasn't entirely steady. "I found him."
Peter.
It was Peter. "I know." Russell's jaw was tight, his eyes doing a slow, careful sweep of her like he needed to confirm the fact with his own eyes rather than her word. Peter's assistant flagged an unusual login an hour ago. "I was already on my way up when your door opened on the security feed." He exhaled, something in his composure cracking slightly at the edges. "You should have called me the second you had a name. I wanted the full picture." "I don't care about the full picture." His hand came up, briefly, to her cheek, an unguarded gesture that surprised them both. "I care about you not doing this alone again." Behind them, two of Russell's men were already moving Peter, quiet and efficient, the way this building handled things that needed handling. Julie watched it happen with a strange, distant clarity, and understood that whatever came next for Peter wasn't something she'd have any say in, or particularly want one. "He said he had a boat reservation Thursday," she said quietly. "He was going to disappear before I finished the trace." "He's not going anywhere now." Russell's voice had gone flat again, the stillness back in place, though his hand hadn't left her shoulder. "You did this. You found what 6 people missed for 18 months. I almost got myself hurt doing it." "You didn't," Russell said, low and certain, "because I got here in time. Next time you tell me the moment it feels wrong." "That wasn't a suggestion, Julie." She looked at him, at the tightness still lingering in his face, the residual adrenaline neither of them had fully shaken off yet, and understood that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, this had stopped being simply a professional arrangement for either of them. "Understood," she said, and this time, she meant to keep the promise. The cleanup took 2 days. Julie spent most of it in her office rebuilding the compliance calendar from scratch, closing the gaps Peter had exploited, restructuring the review schedule so no single person could ever again see the whole map of the syndicate's blind spots at once. It was tedious, meticulous work, and she found something steadying in it, the particular comfort of turning chaos back into columns that balanced. Damon appeared in her doorway on the second afternoon, and for once he didn't lean against the frame with his usual performance of ease. He looked, if anything, slightly chastened, which was a new expression on him.
"Heard it wasn't me," he said.
"It wasn't you. I know you told me about Blissie as a shot across my bow." He came in and sat, uninvited, in the chair across from her desk, which felt oddly like progress. "I want you to know I'd have deserved it if it had been." Julie looked at him for a moment, weighing whether this was sincerity or another performance, and decided, cautiously, that it might actually be the former. "I appreciate you saying that. Don't get used to it." But there was no venom in it now, just something that might, eventually, resemble respect. "For what it's worth, the compliance restructure. It's good work. I've already had 3 people ask if you'll do the same audit on the Miami operation. Tell them to submit a request through the proper channel," Julie said, and Damon actually laughed, short and surprised, before he left her to her spreadsheets. Russell found her that evening, long after most of the executive floor had emptied out, standing at her window with the city spread out gold and glittering below her, the same view she'd once only imagined from the far side of a cubicle wall. "Peter's situation is resolved," he said, not elaborating, and Julie didn't ask him to. There were parts of this world she'd made her peace with a long time ago, and the specifics of resolved didn't require her signature on anything. "The calendar's rebuilt," she said instead. "New protocol. No single office has full visibility into the review schedule anymore. If anyone tries this again, They'll need at least 3 people working together, and I've made sure those 3 people don't particularly like each other. Efficient, Russell said, and there was something warm underneath the word that hadn't been there 2 years ago, or even 2 weeks ago. It's the job. It's more than the job. He came to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she was aware of it in a way she hadn't let herself be aware of things in a long time. You found what an entire compliance department missed for 18 months. You did it while being threatened with your job title as a joke on a Tuesday and nearly getting hurt for it on a Thursday 3 weeks later. That's not just competence, Julie. That's exactly the kind of person I should have been looking for the whole time I sat in that office 10 feet from your desk. Julie turned to look at him and found none of the careful distance she'd spent 2 years maintaining between herself and this man, this building, this entire dangerous, glittering world she'd once only survived by pretending not to see it clearly. She saw it clearly now. She'd built armor for a joke that had turned, somewhere along the way, into something that looked almost like a life she'd chosen rather than one that had simply happened to her. I used to think invisibility was the safest thing I had, she said. I've spent 2 years being very good at not being seen. I noticed you the moment you walked through those doors in that dress, Russell said, quiet and certain. But I think, if I'm honest, some part of me had been noticing you a lot longer than that. I just didn't have a reason to admit it until you gave me one. A financial discrepancy, Julie said, a faint, dry smile tugging at her mouth. Very romantic. I never claimed to be romantic. But he was smiling too now, the rare, unguarded version she'd only seen a handful of times since the terrace at Altano's. I claim to notice value when I see it. And I've been badly, consistently wrong about where the real value in this organization was sitting. The space between them had narrowed without either of them fully deciding to close it, and Julie found she didn't want to step back the way old instinct told her to. She'd spent 2 years making herself small enough not to be a target. She was done with that now, done in a way that felt less like a decision and more like an accounting finally settled. So what happens now? She asked. Officially. For the record. Officially, Russell said, you're the director of financial operations, and as of an hour ago, when I finished the paperwork, you have a seat on the executive board. Unofficially. He reached out, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering a beat longer than the gesture required. Unofficially, I'd like very much to take you to dinner. A real one, this time. Not a joke, not a test. Just dinner. Julie considered him for a long moment, the man who'd nearly cost her a promotion out of boredom, who'd become, over 3 strange and dangerous weeks, someone she trusted with more than her professional standing, and found the answer waiting, already balanced, the way the best numbers always were. I'll check my calendar, she said. I hear it's very well organized these days. Russell laughed, and outside the window the city glittered on, indifferent to all of it, while somewhere below them the ledgers finally closed clean.